Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined by my guest, Dr. Terrence Wandtke. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Wandtke is a professor of cultural studies at East West University, and he studies comic books. Dr. Wandtke, most of us read comic books for fun. Tell us how this fits into your scholarship.
Sure. In terms of my academic interest, this is something that first developed when I was a grad student. I was focusing on 20th century literature, and I found that I really couldn't read 20th century literature without studying other media forms. So I couldn't read the poetry of H.D. without looking at the photography of Alfred Stieglitz. I really came to think of the literature and other media in the 20th and 21st century as something that was continually cross-pollinated. I became interested in that sort of interaction, and that's what led me to focus particularly on the comic book.
Because they are a cross-section from the beginning, right?
From the beginning, you know, we see the way in which the narrative brings together words and images. And so in some ways, when it comes to that cross-pollination, I think we see a pretty pure example with comic books. And I think that it's a nice bridge too between a material culture and a digital culture. We see that transition away from the typical way in which we read with a paper novel to what we do nowadays with web pages.
And that starts early 20th century, I assume, and then it works its way up to what's considered the golden age of comics, which I think most people would be surprised was the 1940s mostly, right? I would have said it was, you know, my youth in the 60s and the 70s, but not. Well, how come?
Well, there's these designations, and they're somewhat artificial, just to identify different periods of comic book production. I think that the golden age is labeled by people who are nostalgic for the classic era of comic books.
But they sold more comics then too, right?
They did. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that they were sold in such great volume because of the cheap production costs. You know, this was an equivalent of the pulp magazines at that time because it was put on very cheap paper, printed very cheaply. The Ben-Day process meant that you didn't have to color everything in completely. It was very inexpensive for them to purchase, and it was the medium that youth picked on. When it comes to early comic books, there was a diverse audience at the start, but it definitely was something that adolescents fell in love with. And of course, that had something to do with the advent of the superhero in the 1930s.
Right. You know, when I think about this in terms of youth and adults, I remember the comics in the newspaper in the 50s and 60s being very adult. I mean, the humor was things that adults got. It was almost like you were learning about your parents and that generation by reading the comics. They really, you know, and even if you look at some of the things that the kids like Charles Schultz's Peanuts and stuff like that, that was a lot of mature humor in those things.
There's a lot of sophistication in Peanuts, and then we can identify other things that are a natural part of the comic strip. And its history, we look at Pogo, we look at Doonesbury, and we see things that are specifically written for an adult audience.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, and supposedly there was a comics culture in the 40s, early 50s that was stronger than anything that followed it, or
it depends how you define comics culture.
Because we've got quite a comics culture now, if you count the movies that they're making from
exactly
from Marvel.
You look at nowadays the way the comics culture is defined. You go to the San Diego Comic-Con, which is enormous, but it doesn't just cover comics because comics are seen as a cultural influencer. So exactly, when I very often we'll have students who say, I love comics, I've seen every Marvel movie, right? That's the way that they understand it. But of course that is limiting comics in a particular way. So I myself mentioned superheroes because it was the first great genre trend in comic books. But comic books are a medium, you know, they're not a story type, and so there's lots of diversity that is represented in the history of comics, but not always due to certain commercial and political factors which limited them as kids stuff for quite some time in American culture.
Yeah, you know, you say you were studying literature, and I'm curious, why why is it that it wasn't until comic books came along that we had this superhero character, right? I mean, you have George Bernard Shaw's Man and Superman, but he wasn't talking about the Man of Steel, right?
Right.
So why did it wait until comic books before anyone thought of this plot idea?
It's hard to say exactly. There are predecessors. So we can go back and we can look at some pulp heroes, like we can look at Doc Savage from the pulps, or we can look at Zorro, right, who is a costumed crime fighter at some level. But I think that when we're dealing with the superhero, usually these characters that do fantastic things with superpowers, they're characters that naturally lend themselves to this visual representation. Right. So Superman was the first of the superheroes. And of course, we know Superman as a character who has fantastic powers, maybe all of the powers. He's so much more powerful than any other character. But he was able to do things within the context of comics that he wouldn't have been able to do within the context of a film, which seemed to sometimes capture the fantastic, maybe with the Universal Monsters movies. Yeah. But still, there was nothing quite like it. The bright colors of the costumes, their abilities represented on the page, that was something that I think really needed comics to come alive.
And certainly it lent itself to that. I think of Johnny Storm, right? The Human Torch, have I got his name right? Yeah. And he's throwing balls of fire around him. It made for great images on the page. But the thing that interests me is that my children watch all of these Marvel movies, right? Mm-hmm. And they never read the comics. Now for me, when the first, well, of course there've been several Superman renditions, but when that Superman came out, and that was the comic book coming to life for me. I enjoyed that at least partially because I was seeing something that I was familiar with on these pages coming alive on the screen. But these people that are watching them now, they've never seen this, so they're just attracted to that character, aren't they? Right.
They're attracted to the character, and now we can do on screen things that we couldn't back in the 1940s. Yeah. So they seem much more plausible than they ever had been before. Right. Now, I remember when the Christopher Reeve Superman came out, the tagline was that you'll believe a man can fly, right? Oh, and so that was part of the special effects innovation of that film.
And a lot of references to things like that, where he grabs Lois Lane as she's flying out of the helicopter, and he says, "I've got you," and she says, "Yeah, who's got you?"
Exactly. So part of the enjoyment for me is the intertextuality. So I'm able to think of when I originally encountered this character in the comics, and also the multiple versions of these characters, because they revamp them every once in a while. And so that's part of the joy for me. But when I think about the intertextual experience of my students with superhero movies, they start listing off all the different Batmans they know from the movies.
Right.
I saw the Michael Keaton Batman movie. I saw the Christian Bale Batman movie. And that's interesting for them. So that operates in some of the same ways that I do when I'm comparing the text to the film.
So if you think of the comics culture, if you will, right? How would you characterize it today versus the comics culture in the Golden Age?
The comics culture in the Golden Age was much more uniform. So if we're thinking about the 1930s and 1940s, comic books appealed primarily to adolescents. As I said, there always was a diverse readership. But initially, it was oriented towards young readers. The visual narrative was seen as something that would appeal to them. Especially with the superhero, we started to see stories that were geared more towards young readers. But this readership grew up. One of the interesting things about the superhero is that if we go back to those Golden Age roots, it was thought to be a short-lived phenomenon. So we had the advent of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Captain Marvel, Captain America. That was all in a short space of a few years, the late 30s, into the 40s. But after the end of World War II, the sales of superhero comics started to fade. The readers didn't go away, though. They just sought out different material. And so we started to see different genres come to the forefront then. Comics culture changed in the sense that it grew up. It became a little bit more diverse. It started fairly diverse, but it was more diverse now because we had anthology comics that were devoted to espionage thrillers that were devoted to crime, that were devoted to horror.
When you talk about the comics culture, you're talking about the fictional culture, essentially, right? I was wondering, was there any observation of there being some cultural phenomena that was particularly receptive to comics? Like I remember, you know, there were I think 2 days a week that the comics came in at the local drugstore,
Right.
and I would go there, and there'd be one or two other kids there that were just waiting for those things to come out, and we'd sit there and read them. We'd buy a couple, and we'd talk about them. So when I read about comics culture, I was kind of thinking about that. I mean, did people discuss comics like they talk about hot TV shows today? Where they, I know this is a period where radio was really king, right?
Right.
Yeah.
In terms of the fan culture,
Yeah.
what we saw, I would say from the 1930s to the 1970s, was a very interactive culture. So my own experience was similar to yours, you know,
Yeah.
where I'd have this group that I knew because we all read comic books, and we trade comic books.
Yeah.
There was this sense of comic books as ephemeral. You didn't necessarily hang on to them and treat them as collectibles like many people do now. So there was this culture that started to form. It became more formalized, too, as we moved into the 1950s, particularly around the genres of crime and then horror. So EC put out a lot of the famous horror comics of the time period. We're most familiar with Tales from the Crypt because it's been adapted in different forms.
Yeah.
And it had these colorful hosts that would introduce the horror tales. They used black humor to sort of liven things up.
Vincent Price types.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the things that happened at that time is Bill Gaines, the publisher of EC, recognized that this was a phenomenon and he could capitalize on it. So that was where we saw the first fan club. Are you an EC addict? That was the tagline, are you an EC addict? And so he started to create this. And when people think about convention culture, they often date it back to that time, to the phenomenon of the people who loved EC comics.
Well, and there was a psychology professor around that period, right? Who published something saying that comics were corrupting the youth, and came up with this theory that what children were reading about, they were going to emulate in their own behavior, right? Which is, as far as I know, is the beginning of the argument against letting kids watch TV, right?
Right.
Except he was talking about comic books. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a fascinating piece of comics history. It is what explains why comic books were so long regarded as kids' stuff. So the psychologist is Frederick Wortham, and his rather bombastically titled book was Seduction of the Innocent.
Right.
And it was there that he made his case against comics.
This is 47, 50?
Yeah, so this is the end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s.
Okay.
So there was a famous controversy then in the 50s that came about because he wrote this book. Other people had reacted against comic books in the past. Some people claimed they were causing illiteracy. Some people said they had bad messages. It never really took hold until Frederick Wortham came along, because Frederick Wortham said the comic books cause juvenile delinquency.
I see.
And that was a buzzword at the time. We were in the middle of the Cold War, and everyone knew juvenile delinquents grew up to be communists.
Right.
So there was a sort of hysteria that revolved around comics at the time, and particularly the two genres that I was talking about, crime and horror. These were seen as comics that were especially dangerous to kids. And as far as that emulation argument, we don't want our kids to act like criminals. We don't want them to do the terrible things that we see in horror comics. Now, they weren't written for kids. They were written for an older audience. Right. EC Comics had a tendency to be gratuitous, but also had interesting, sophisticated stories and a higher level of narrative and visual art than we've ever seen before. Due to Frederick Wortham's book and in his campaigning, we had one of the first congressional hearings on a particular medium at that time. So the Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency called these hearings. Frederick Wortham testified. Bill Gaines from EC Comics was there, but he was torn apart. Basically, he made an argument about comics as art. He made an argument about unfair censorship. But as soon as a politician held up a cover from one of his horror comics that showed a serial killer with an axe in one hand and a decapitated hand in the other, it was all over.
Yeah.
So there were comics burnings, and the industry then flocked together. They were in panic mode.
It's an interesting phenomenon because I can see this happening in other, the Beatle records burning,
right.
10 years later, right? That's very interesting. Go ahead.
Right, and we can see that, right? We can see this pattern reemerging.
Because the Beatles were corrupting the youth,
right?
Initially.
Pop music, video games, there's a tendency to do this on a regular basis with this new media that threatens to corrupt our youth. The Comics Code was a way in which the industry regulated itself. So they came up with a code by which they prohibited profanity, sexuality, violence. And because horror was such a focus of what Frederick Wortham was doing, they put special things in there to prohibit horror. So you couldn't have vampires, you couldn't have werewolves. It was strangely specific.
And crime couldn't pay.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and that was the name of one of the famous crime comics at that time was Crime Does Not Pay. But it did pretty well for most of the stories in there. In terms of the ending, yes, you had to always show everyone getting their just punishments. So crime and horror couldn't operate anymore within comics due to those restrictions. What we saw as a consequence is we saw the continued presence of teen humor comics like Archie, and then we saw the resurgence of the superhero. This genre that everyone thought was going to die out came back because comic book companies had these properties, and they decided we can make this very family friendly.
Now, he also made, I think, an argument about these comics being linked to pornography and things like that. Do you remember some of the associations he made with that?
Sure. He looked at images, and he often identified hidden images. So he would. There's a famous image from Seduction, the Innocent. It's a man's shoulder, and he made the argument that it looked like a vagina, which was very strange. It's one of those things where people, if they thought twice, probably felt like Frederick Wortham was looking too hard.
Or that it looked like the women were drawn sometimes naked and then clothes were painted on them, right? I think that was one of the arguments.
But on top of that, he was critical primarily of crime and horror comics, but he was critical of superhero comics as well.
Yeah.
So he was critical of Wonder Woman and her image and what she was communicating to the youth.
And how did you see Wonder Woman?
Scantily clad, and one of the implicit things in there was that of course this was post-war years in which Rosie the Riveter went back home, right? Back to the household, and so this image of a liberated Amazon wasn't appealing to the culture anymore. Also, there's always been jokes over the years about the sort of funny relationship between Batman and Robin. It really comes from Frederick. He took it seriously. He suggested that there was a potential homosexual relationship between the Dark Knight and the Boy Wonder.
Yeah. So that kind of backed things up a little bit. Did this get kick-started again in the 60s because of the underground press? I know there were a lot of things I never thought would get printed that I was seeing in underground newspapers in the 60s. So they just broke these rules.
Right. It really did back things up in some ways. So we can look at the ways that not only did comics change because the genres were restricted, but it also consolidated power with a few companies. So there's just a few companies that were really publishing comics and had a lot of control over that. But there were many ways in which people got around the restrictions of the Comics Code. So there were black and white comics magazines that were published at that time by official publishing houses, and they put out magazines like Creepy and Eerie, so they were able to continue doing horror in that fame.
Mad Magazine was black and white when it came out initially, is that why?
And that was the way that EC really was able to survive. EC was all about crime and horror.
Yeah.
They couldn't do that anymore after that, but then they turned their attention to Mad Magazine. They produced Mad Magazine.
Very interesting.
There were many comics that came out at that time as part of the countercultural movement, comics with an X at the end, and they were put out independently, so separate from established publishing houses, and they would include all of these things that were prohibited in the Comics Code: drug use and sexuality and sometimes violence.
Right. So that evolves into where we're at today, right? Where pretty much there are no specific restrictions. It's interesting that we've got things on TV now like Family Guy and South Park, right? Is that yeah? How would these things have been seen back then?
Oh, they would have been horrified by these things. Because in terms of media forms, right, there's nothing inherent about any media form, like painting or literature or film, that designates it appropriate for just one age and not another.
Yeah.
But that was done in the United States with both animation and comic books. Comic books for the reasons that we mentioned. You know, it was originally a phenomenon amongst young readers, but it wasn't allowed to grow up, and this controversy kept it in place. And because of those attitudes, you know, that only kid-friendly material is what would be appropriate within the context of animation or comic books. They would have been horrified by that. But over the years, the restrictions were loosened. That was primarily a result of the movement beyond the newsstand and the drugstores where we bought our comic books to the comic book store and eventually the bookstore. So we started to move comic books off the beaten path. So they weren't as well seen, and we started to develop a loyal fan base. The 1980s were the era of the comic book store, and at that time, the youth audience was really taken up by arcade video games and the Atari game system, things like that. In the 1980s, we saw the comic book audience growing up again, the same way that we did back in the 1940s, where it was stunted. We saw that in the 80s again. Comic books became more mature in general. So superhero comics were written more often for adults. And on top of that, publishing was much easier to do, much cheaper to do. So we saw independent publishing houses come up, and the things that were marketed for comic book stores diversified comics. We had
so this is a kind of a renaissance then, isn't it?
It really was. We also were able to see certain marginalized voices come to the forefront. I think because of comics' lack of respectability, there was an attraction between those people whose stories might not be told elsewhere, but we really see this in the 80s. So we see Hispanic stories that are told through the Hernandez brothers with Love and Rockets. We see working class stories told through American Splendor by Harvey Pekar and his autobiographical tale. We start to see voices that we just haven't seen before. And still didn't see as much in the 80s in other forms, you know, more highly regulated Hollywood film, for instance.
Right. If we were, as adults, to go back and reread the comics we read in the 60s, would we find themes that we didn't realize were there, do you think?
I think so. I mean, even if you go back to the 60s, which was really the height of comics code culture, there's lots of interesting things that happened then. You know, one of the difficulties that superhero writers had to deal with at the time was how to keep things clean, but also keep them interesting. So we see a variety of what was referred to as imaginary stories. There were imaginary stories about Superman, and they would reassure you at the end of each one of these imaginary stories that this didn't really happen. You could come back next week and read the next story of Superman. One of the best stories in that vein was a story about the death of Superman. And it was really interesting because it dealt with how we have to contend in a world that did not have Superman. The 1960s story was a single issue, and it basically showed how the part that I really liked about it is it showed how Lex Luthor became warped by his obsession with Superman. He could have cured cancer if he wanted to, but instead, you know, he was part of this culture that had to outdo. He was the superhero gone bad. That was the interesting thing about it. In the 1990s, they killed off Superman just for a little while, right? Because he had to come back. He's the cornerstone of the DC universe. But they revisited that story. And what they did was they extended that portion. So the best part of the story, it's a big battle at the beginning, right? Because you have to have the battle royale that leads to the death of our favorite superhero. Then we have a world without Superman, that's the next part. And then we have the return of Superman. Really, the most interesting part of that story is the world without Superman. Because we start to get stories of relatively minor characters. Lois Lane was always a big part, but she really became a focal point in that part. We had the stories of Ma and Pa Kent at that point. It was these things that I think make superhero stories the best, when they deal with the world around the superheroes and the people who are not superpowered in a superpowered world.
That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Terrence Wandtke for joining us today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. See you next time.